He found two helpless Bigfoot babies shivering and dying in the snow outside his cabin. He brought them inside and kept them safe through the night. But the next morning, something unbelievable happened. When he looked outside, a massive Bigfoot tribe surrounded his cabin in complete silence. What followed was an encounter unlike anything he had ever experienced. Elijah was 63 years old and lived alone in a small cabin set deep in the forest. Winters were always hard, but he was used to the silence, the heavy snow, and the cold that pressed against the windows. On this night, the storm was worse than usual. Snow hammered the roof, the wind pushed hard at the walls, and the trees groaned under the weight of ice. He sat close to the fire, adding wood from the stack he kept beside the stove. The flames snapped and hissed, fighting back the chill that tried to creep inside. Elijah pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and listened to the storm. Nights like this usually brought nothing but wind and drifting snow, but something broke through the noise. At first, he thought it was just the wind shifting, but then he heard it again. Faint cries that carried over the storm. It wasn't the call of a coyote, nor the low growl of a bear. The sound was high, thin, and desperate. Elijah stiffened, straining his ears. The cries came again, uneven and weak, almost like a child out in the cold. He rose from his chair and moved to the door. The storm howled as he cracked it open, icy air rushing inside. The cries were clearer now, just beyond the cabin in the snow. They were too human-like to ignore and too fragile to belong to anything that could survive long in the storm. Elijah knew he had to look. He pulled the door wider and stepped onto the porch. The storm cut at his face, the snow so heavy it blurred the line between ground and air. He heard the sound again, closer now, thin and broken. He took a few steps forward, his boots sinking deep into the drift. Then he saw them, two small shapes huddled together at the edge of his cabin wall, half buried in snow. At first, he thought they were children lost and left behind, but as he drew closer, his breath caught. These were not children. Their bodies were covered in thick, matted hair, their faces broad but soft, and their large dark eyes blinked at him with fear and exhaustion. They were young, no taller than 3 or 4 feet, and they trembled so hard their small shoulders shook under the weight of the storm. One gave a weak cry, and the other pressed closer as if to shield it. Their limbs were thin, their movements slow, as if the cold had already drained the life out of them. Elijah froze where he stood. Every story he had ever heard about the creatures in the forest came to mind. Tales of Bigfoot that most people dismissed as legend. Yet here they were, 2 of them, young and helpless at his feet. His first instinct was fear. He looked into the dark trees, half expecting something larger to come crashing through, but the storm howled, and nothing moved beyond the snow. Elijah knew the creatures wouldn't last another hour in the cold. Whatever they were still alive, and they needed warmth. He pushed aside his fear, bent down, and lifted them one at a time. Their bodies were heavy with wet fur, their skin beneath icy cold to the touch. He carried them back inside, closed the door against the storm, and laid them near the fire. For the first time, he allowed himself to breathe. Elijah shut the door tight against the storm and set the latch. The 2 small creatures lay on his rug, their fur clumped with melting snow. They shivered so violently he feared they might not survive. He pulled 2 heavy wool blankets from his bed and wrapped them both, tucking the edges close to hold in the heat. They were slow to respond at first, their breathing ragged and weak. But once the fire's warmth reached them, they stirred, small hands clutching the fabric as if afraid it would be taken away. Elijah knelt beside them, studying their features under the flicker of firelight. Their faces carried both human and animal traits, broad brows, flat noses, and wide, dark eyes that reflected the flames. Their small mouths opened with faint whimpers, and their expressions showed fear mixed with trust. One reached toward him, its hand larger than a human child's but with the same shape, 5 fingers thick and strong. He hesitated only a moment before taking it. The creature's grip tightened around his fingers, and he felt its trembling ease. The second soon leaned against his leg, clinging to him as though he were the only safe thing in the world. Elijah went to his cupboard and found a loaf of bread left from the day before. He tore it into small pieces, softened them with water, and offered the food. The infants sniffed, then slowly began to eat. Their movements were cautious, but hunger pushed them to accept. He gave them sips of water from a tin cup, which they drank with clumsy eagerness. Sitting by the fire, Elijah felt a weight settle in his chest. He had no children left of his own, no family nearby. Yet here were two helpless beings depending on him as if he were their father. Against all reason, he felt protective of them. Morning light crept through the cracks in the shutters. The storm had eased, leaving the world outside silent and buried under snow. Elijah moved quietly so as not to wake the two infants still bundled near the fire. Their small chests rose and fell steadily, proof they had survived the night. He set a kettle on the stove and sliced what little bread he had left for his own breakfast. The fire popped, and for a moment the cabin felt almost ordinary again. But then something shifted outside. A sound, not the storm, not the creak of ice, caught his attention. Elijah walked to the frosted window and brushed away the thin layer of ice with his sleeve. What he saw made his body freeze. Shadows moved among the trees. At first, he thought they were tricks of the light, but the shapes grew clearer. They were tall, towering. His eyes widened as he counted them. Not 2, not 10, but dozens. The clearing around his cabin was filled with massive figures standing silent in the snow. Dark fur covered their broad shoulders, and steam rose from their breaths in the morning cold. Elijah's hands trembled on the windowsill. He counted quickly, 20, 30, maybe more. Every one of them faced the cabin, unmoving, watchful. Their presence was heavy, their silence louder than the storm had ever been. His first thought was of the infants, still wrapped by the fire. They were not lost after all. They belonged to these beings, and now their kin had come. Elijah stepped back from the window, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it. The cabin no longer felt safe. The babies were not alone, and neither was he. Elijah stood frozen at the window, his breath clouding the glass. The shapes outside did not move, but their presence pressed against his cabin like a weight. He knew he couldn't hide. The two infants by the fire belonged to them. If he stayed inside, fear would consume him. He straightened his shoulders, pulled his coat tight, and walked to the door. His hand lingered on the latch. For a moment he thought of barring it, pretending the world outside did not exist. But the silence was too heavy, the waiting too long. With a steady breath, he lifted the latch and eased the door open. The cold hit him first. Then came the sight. One of the giants stepped forward from the group. He was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill the doorway if he tried. His fur was dark, thick with frost, and his face carried lines of age and authority. He stopped a few paces from the porch and locked eyes with Elijah. Elijah knew at once this was the leader. Behind him, the tribe stood in perfect stillness. Every gaze was fixed on his cabin, on what lay inside. The air was heavy with expectation. Elijah gripped the doorframe to steady himself. Fear ran through him, sharp and cold, but he forced his hands to stay visible and empty. He made no move to threaten, no move to retreat. His heart pounded in his chest, but he held his ground. The leader did not growl or advance. He only watched him, his dark eyes flicking past his shoulder toward the firelight where the infants rested. His meaning was clear. Elijah swallowed hard. He understood. They knew their young were inside, and now they wanted them back. Elijah turned from the door and looked back at the fire. The two infants were awake now, their dark eyes following his every move. They made soft whimpering sounds as if they too sensed what waited outside. His legs felt heavy, but he forced himself to move. He bent down, lifted one small body into his arms, then the other. Their fur was warm now, their weight solid against his chest. The moment he held them, they clung to him, gripping his coat with surprising strength. Step by step, Elijah carried them to the doorway. The cold air rushed in as he pushed the door open wider. The tribe stirred. Dozens of heads turned, and the leader stepped forward again, towering in the snow. The reaction was instant. The babies wriggled in his arms, stretching their hands toward the group. Small cries filled the air, sharper than the storm had ever been. The tribe responded with low murmurs, deep sounds that vibrated through the clearing. Elijah's heart pounded, but he stayed steady. He looked at the leader. His eyes met Elijah's. Dark, steady, unreadable, yet not cruel. In that silent moment he felt the leader's message. He knew Elijah had sheltered them. He knew Elijah had chosen compassion over fear. The leader took one slow step closer, then stopped. He did not reach for the infants. Not yet. He simply stood, his gaze fixed on Elijah, and then it passed between them. An unspoken understanding. Elijah had protected what mattered most. The leader lifted one massive hand and gave a slow, deliberate signal. The tribe stirred, but did not rush forward. Instead, two smaller adults stepped out from the group and approached the cabin with careful movements. Their size dwarfed Elijah, but their steps were measured, respectful. The infants squirmed harder in his arms, reaching for them. Elijah bent down and released the young ones into the snow at his feet. The two adults crouched low, gathering the little ones gently against their chests. The cries stopped almost at once. The babies pressed close to them, safe again with their own kind. Elijah stayed in the doorway, gripping the frame for balance. He expected anger or perhaps a warning, but none came. The tribe stood in silence, their great bodies still against the white of the snow. The leader's gaze never left him. There was no hostility in it, only acknowledgement. One of the adults carrying the infants gave a deep rumble, almost like a note of thanks. The sound carried through the clearing, low and steady. Elijah didn't know what it meant, but he felt it was not meant as a threat. Then another figure, tall and broad, stepped forward from the group. It carried something in its hand, a small branch smoothed at the ends. The creature bent and laid it carefully on the snow near his door. When it straightened, it gave one slow nod before stepping back into line, and no words were spoken. No growls were raised. With the infants secure, the leader turned, and the tribe moved as one. Their huge forms faded into the trees, their steps so controlled they left only faint impressions in the snow. Within moments, the clearing was empty again. Only the token remained at Elijah's door. The clearing was silent once more. The great shapes had vanished into the forest as if they had never been there. Only the snow remained, marked faintly by tracks already beginning to fill with drifting flakes. Elijah stood in his doorway, staring into the trees, half expecting them to return, but the woods held their silence. He looked down at the object left behind. The small branch lay where the creature had placed it, smooth and deliberate, unlike any fallen twig. Elijah bent slowly, picked it up and held it in his hands. It was nothing ordinary. It was a sign, a message he couldn't fully understand, but he knew it had meaning. He carried it inside and set it carefully on the mantel above the fire. The cabin felt quiet again, the only sound the crackle of wood and the soft whistle of wind against the window. Yet the stillness was different now. Elijah sat in his chair, staring at the flames. He was shaken, but beneath that, something else filled his heart. He had been trusted, if only for a night, trusted to protect the most precious lives of a hidden people. It was a night he would never forget.